Welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining this Zoom talk, which is about the Orchard Barn project, something which I've recently become involved with. So Orchard Barn is located in the remote corner of Ringshall, about 5 miles southwest of Stowmarket. It was co-founded by Sarah Partridge in 2007 as a community interest company with 12 members. The main aims of the project are to encourage local community involvement, to develop an off-grid, low-impact eco-site, to learn how to use the tools and skills developed by earlier generations, now in danger of becoming lost, and by restoring the buildings still remaining on the site, or for which there is documentary evidence. Practical skills can be gained in a very direct, hands-on way, which can then be transferred to our modern life and help reduce our carbon footprint and teach us all the value of our local resources and what can be achieved through team building and working together. Now, I've just got to adjust this because more than 4,000 volunteers have been involved in some aspect of the project. So the first phase, back in 2007, involved the restoration of the threshing barn, which is the main structure still standing. You see it's just about standing with well propped up, big gaping holes in the side, and plenty of work to do on the frame to get it anything like good condition, not to mention the roof. Some of you may remember that about 10 years ago, the SHBG had a visit to the site to see the new roof, which Rick Lewis and a team of volunteers and trainees were in the process of constructing. So this is what it looks like now. This is the barn with its new roof. And this is the inside view of it. You can see the wall plates were repaired, the tie beams and new braces, and the whole of the roof has been rebuilt. So we've got common rafters and purlin, glass purlin. We've got riven laths and riven oak shingles on the roof. And here we can see this was completed in 2011 with the daunting task of hand cleaving, dressing and fixing over 20,000 oak shingles. Since then, a masonry stove and beaten earth floor and wattle and daub infill panels have been constructed. This is inside the main barn. And then outside, a cart lodge style craft barn has been added. This is open fronted with earth fast posts, these ones here, clay lump and earth rendered back wall along the back there, and yet more shingles on the wavy elm pole rafters all the way along here. You can see a lovely undulating roof line. We haven't quite finished the ridge yet, but otherwise it's complete. A green woodworking area has been created further down in the site, and the orchard has been cleared and the fruit trees renovated with some uncommon varieties being identified. A productive vegetable garden and polytunnel have become an integral part of the operation, helping to recycle waste products and organic matter on the site into valuable crops. And here you can see they've got a rainwater harvesting system, so they collect all the water off the roof in these big tanks, and they can use it for watering the vegetables. And then also they're experimenting with solar panels here, which they're hoping to generate some low-level amounts of electricity to store in batteries inside. And if there's anybody who has any interest in this type of project, I'm sure Sarah would be keen to hear from you to further this side of the work, because you still need connecting up, basically, I think. From the outset, it was obvious that the site had also included a quite substantial timber-framed house, the remains of which were still just about visible, where it had collapsed and become totally submerged by the brambles, saplings, ivy and nettles, which now completely covered the site. And here you can see a photograph taken in about 1960, showing that this house was still just about standing then. This is the south end with a bit of the roof still on it. You can see one front door was about here somewhere, and then there's a big chimney stack still standing in the north end of Bay 4 here, which is largely disintegrated by then. And when she took over the site, it was mostly looking like this, and the house is somewhere underneath there. Back in 2007, when she first took on the site, Sarah commissioned Lee Alston to carry out a historical survey of both the site and the house which once stood there. Here is what Lee wrote in his summary, and I'll read this out to you because it makes quite an interesting comment. The house adjacent to Orchard Barn is among the most remarkable buildings in Suffolk. The fine timber frame structure of the late 16th century, extending to over 50 feet in length and complete with original diamond mullion windows, ingle-nook fireplace and symmetrical wall bracing, lies empty and partly collapsed in a bramble patch. Despite its predicament, most of the principal components of the frame, including wall studs, tie beams, arch braces, story posts and massive principal joists, remain in sound condition, and the building could readily be restored by a specialist in historic carpentry. Notwithstanding its impressive historic credentials and a proximity to the road, the house is not listed and does not appear on the Register of Historic Buildings at Risk, presumably because it was hidden from successive English heritage inspectors by external render and undergrowth. If the structure was properly restored, incorporating the surviving timbers, it would retain sufficient original fabric and historic integrity to remain worthy of listing. Well, now we all know Lee and his enthusiasm and passion to retain every scrap of historical fabric. But based on what, some 14 years later, we have actually got to work with, this heap of timber here, I think even the most skilled specialists in historic carpentry would throw up their hands in horror at the thought of using most of the remaining timbers. This is one of the big, massive cross ties supporting the first floor, which we did manage to pull out of the undergrowth and which we've sort of brought inside here and is now awaiting repair in Rick's yard. So we are hoping to incorporate this one. But as you can see, it's completely hollowed out at this end. And in the center here, where the spine beam, big spine beam came in at both sides, it's completely hollow as well. So this is the one that was alongside it. And as you can see, Rick Lewis has done his best with one of the massive cross ties for the floor. You can see how this has had patches bolted to it to try and reinforce it. Rods going through here. This is where it's going to be framed into our bay post. But the rest of the timber, he also led courses to repair one of the main corner posts and a few of the studs. But the rest of the timber project is going to be new oak, sourced from local managed woodlands and converted in the wood where they were felled. Now this is Lee's elevation drawing of how he surmised that the front elevation of the house would have looked based on what he was able to work out from the timbers that were submerged by the brambles. And as you can see, he's showing 1, 2, 3, and a possible fourth bay here with the chimney stack at this point here and this entrance doorway here. What Lee's report did highlight was the somewhat unusual nature of the building, and it raised speculation as to what its original design and purpose might have been. What we know from the small amount of original fabric we can still read is that the building had at least 3 bays and a massively heavy first floor frame with large section chamfered and decorated joists, but no evidence for any ground floor or first floor internal dividing walls. So the timbers that ran through at this point here, across the building here, and the same with the one there, and also the tie beams. There were no mortise slots, neither the tie beams or first floor cross ties. There were also a number of relatively small windows with diamond mullions and shutter grooves. It's quite elaborately braced, with wall braces all set to the outside. It's these ones here, suggesting that the timber frame may have been exposed externally, possibly a sign that someone with money to spend wanted to show off their wealth. Now, if we look at this Ordnance Survey map from 1904, we can see that the Orchard Barn site is this area around here. This is the barn itself with its cattle yard here and cart lodges there. And this is the outline of the house. And you can see it's quite clearly divided into two, with one, what potentially might be 3 bays here, and then another piece here, which looks as though it's separate from this one here. And if we look at this house here, which is on the adjacent property, you can see that there's a big house here, which is set gable end onto the road. And that led to some speculation that maybe this suggests there was a cross wing here, or maybe the original house started here and that this was added on as an extension later. But in actual fact, if we look at the frame itself and look at this early photograph, we can see this is the front of the house here, going right up to the corner. And you can see that the roof line continues right the way across, right up to the corner here. So there wasn't a cross wing here. There was actually a bay 4 here. And you can see there's a doorway there, which suggests that the house has been subdivided into 2 properties. And that's probably what it's showing on the Ordnance Survey map. And maybe the bit that it shows on the back wall there was a lean-to on the end, rather than being 2 separate builds. Right here, and this shows, this is where the chimney stack is, and that bay 4 would have gone on beyond there. If the frame had 4 bays, and it looks like it did, there's clear evidence for a mid-rail continuing from the bay post that was here, and that's now lying down here. So there was a mid-rail continuing past the chimney stack into the 4th bay. Then the current door position doesn't really fit with the most conventional layouts for a frame from about 1580. There's no evidence of any smoke blackening on any surviving timbers, so presumably it was never an open hall with a central hearth. Either the building was used for a purpose for which it did not need heating or cooking, or the chimney stack and fireplace are contemporary with the original build, which would certainly be possible with a late 16th century date. If we now look at that bay post, which has now fallen down, this is the inside face of it. That's where the cross tie sat, taking the 1st floor frame. That's where there was a brace going up from this post into the tie beam. And if you look at the side here, there was a mortise, there's a mortise in there, there was a mid-rail coming in there. There's another one down here showing another mid-rail carrying on. So this was never an end wall corner post. It was always part of the front wall frame. And then if this is the cross tie, which actually fitted into that post. And it's quite interesting to look at this joint here, which until the beam came down, we weren't really able to see. And you can see how the spine beam was actually framed into that with a housing here at an angle, and then a big area here where there's a big tenon sitting, and presumably the top of a mortise on the mortise wall on the top of this cross tie. So that shows how they actually cut this joint, which you can't generally see. If we're lucky, I might be able to play a little video, which is actually on Sarah's YouTube channel for Orchard Barn, where you can see more videos. And I think this might play if we're lucky. A bit of time. You might need to adjust your volume to this because it doesn't come out very clearly. It was recorded actually outside a few weeks ago. This is the last of the cross tie beams, which was in front of the fireplace, and you can see the limestone stop chamfer here. And we'll carry on along the face of this timber down to the middle. You can see where the spine beam came into the side of it and where it was supported here. So this gives you an idea of what type of joint they used to hold that massive spine beam in place. So there's a housing here, an angle on it, and then an area in here where the top of the spine beam was set. So this is the other side of the same cross tie we were looking at, and you can see that the face of this has no sign of any joints coming into it at all along here, whereas the other ones had another spine beam coming out this way. So that suggests either the original building terminated at this point, and this would have been part of the end wall, or because later on the chimney stack was built against this, which was where this has come out of. Either that or whatever happened in the rest of the building didn't involve a spine beam coming in here, and so perhaps didn't have a floor frame. But either way, this cross tie is slightly different from the other two that we've been repairing. This is the dowel post that has just fallen down from where it's been wedged up in the ash tree, and shows that there was a mid-rail coming in at this point here, and then another one carrying on from here, going across beyond where the chimney stack is. And that indicates that this wasn't a corner post, so the frame looks like it was always designed to carry on into a fourth bay rather than terminate in the line of the chimney stack. So that suggests that perhaps from the outset there were four bays, but perhaps the end bay didn't have a floor frame. Or if it did have a floor frame, it went into the chimney stack that may have already been there. So anyway, we'll cut out of the video there, I think, and carry on. When I first got involved in the project in 2019, the idea was that we would finish cutting. So I think I've skipped a page there. To return to the current project, by 2017, it was finally decided that the time had come to embark on the most challenging task they had yet faced, the reconstruction of the farmhouse, which was originally associated with the site. This had always been Sarah's aim, and the success of the first completed builds, all based on volunteer labour and self-financing training courses led by skilled local craftsmen with additional funding coming from charity sources, specifically for education and training purposes, gave her the confidence to go ahead. And this is a model of the proposed house frame based on Lee's drawings, which is what we're actually working to. So the main drawback of this approach has been the piecemeal, stop-start nature and extremely long, drawn-out timescale. Courses were only run during the summer months and put on as and when funding and volunteers were available. And here we see Rick with some of the volunteers at the start of one of the projects, so one of the courses. They're laying out one of the side walls, I think this is. And here you can see where they've been working on the end wall, and this was the one corner post, the original corner post, which they're endeavouring to repair and reintroduce into the frame. Here we can see the mid-rail joint going into the repaired corner post. And here they are on another course discussing one of the elements here of the side wall. And you can see how they're framing this view, creating a jowl post here. They've left this as a squared off section, which will later become formed into a jowl for the teasel tenon and tie beam assembly. For the moment, it's cut out of a single timber. So the course is continued spasmodically. Here we've got that repaired post again. here you can see what they had to do to the top of it to enable it to be jointed into the frame. Lots of patches and fixings. Here we are on the side wall coming together. So finally, by 2019, the south end gable up to the tie level, bay 1 and 2 of the front and back walls were complete. Rick Lewis, who had run all the carpentry courses right back from the start of the project in 2007, decided that he needed to take a break and persuaded me that I should get involved. After all, it was right on my doorstep, and I had started my timber framing life dismantling old barns and reconstructing them. And this is one from the archives, one of my early attempts to rebuild a barn frame. I think this one went up down in Wiltshire somewhere. But you can see we're using very basic tools and equipment, tripods and winches to actually lift everything in place, and chain blocks, and basic scaffold tires to give ourselves platforms. So we did manage to get timbers of similar sort of size and scale as the Orchard Barn House into position and assembled. So always up to a challenge, I agreed to help out, fitting in what time I could on top of my already full diary of frame repairs and new builds. Now, as most of you probably realise, when building with green oak, the usual approach is to cut the frame, complete frame in a covered yard somewhere, probably during the early part of the year, tucked up out of the ice and snow. And this is one I built earlier, along with a timber framing colleague of mine, Gary Chaplin, who, and when we, this timber all came into his yard, it was all literally covered in a layer of snow and frozen absolutely solid. And we got it in here and gradually soon thawed out, and we were able to cut this frame over the next few weeks, working on it, gradually working our way through these packs of timber so that we got it all framed up. In about 4 to 6 weeks, we had it all framed. The idea is that then when the weather improves in the spring, the whole frame is erected on site on its new brick plinth and pegged together, while the timbers are all still nice and straight and the joints all go together easily, just like that. And this is a picture I took literally last Friday, that same frame, nicely assembled. But it can then be left covered over with a roof and left to settle down and shrink, helping to lock all the joints together. Unfortunately, because of the slow piecemeal nature of our project, up to now, after 4+ years, with all the timbers all left outside, stacked under tin sheets. And here's one heap of timbers here, part of the end wall. They have already done most of their twisting and distorting. Now this mid-rail is what Will Wall, when he first saw it, he said, "Oh, there's our propeller beam," which he's quite right. If you have a look, I know the slide's on its side, but that's because this is the orientation the beam will take when it's in the house. So this is a mid-rail. There will be a bay post here, and at the other end, another bay post there, running up here. Somehow, we've got to get this tenon on the end of this timber here into an upright post there, and at the same time, this one here has got to go into a vertical post here. And as you can see, there's rather a difference looking along the length of that. Not only that, there's a huge great joint here, cut here for our spine beam, which has to come in the middle and has to be sitting nice and horizontally there. So how we're going to end up getting all these timbers together, I'm not sure. It's likely to be a real challenge, and we may well end up having to recut joints to make them fit. When I first got involved in 2019, the idea was that we would finish cutting enough of the frame up to wall plate and tie height so that we could attempt to raise the first 2 bays. This involved sourcing timber, converting it, and then framing the new floor frames and internal cross frames with massively curved tie beams and large curved braces to match the original frame. So I'll take you through what we actually did. So we're looking at considering the first two bays here and the end wall. So we already had framed the front wall and the back wall and the end wall up to the tie beam and wall plate. We needed still to get the tie beams for the internal frames made and the braces, these two particularly, and the internal braces, and also this big heavy floor frame, spine beams here, floor joists here, and then consider getting repaired the cross tie, this cross tie here. So we went out to a local woodland. In this case, it's Raden Great Wood near Hadley, not very far from the Orchard Barn project, about no more than 10 miles away. And we found this nicely curved tree here. And we thought, could we, using all hand tools, because we want to try and do as much by hand as we can, somehow convert this and create two tie beams. And we thought, well, we'll flatten off the top surface and do the same with the bottom using side axes and hewing it to make it reasonably flat. And then if we were very lucky, we might be able to find a way to prop this up sufficiently so that we could use pit saw to rip all the way along the length of this timber to give us two matching timbers to use for tie beams. So, as you can see, we managed to flatten off the face, and with a bit of effort, with enough of us, we managed to get one end of that beam propped up onto a higher level trestle and wedged up with a platform of pallets, and we started sawing into the middle of it here. As you can see, we've got pit saw here. I think this is Rick Lewis's one, which he kindly lent us, and we started sawing, and we carried on sawing. We sawed a bit more, and there was a team of us, so we took it in turns. As you can see, we were all quite keen, but we were anxious to take a break every so often. And by this time, we had managed to saw down to there, and we managed to reverse the timber around, propped up this end, and we approached from the other end, and we've sawing down there. We're wedging open the cuts to enable the saw to cut. So we kept on sawing and sawed a bit more. And then Will Wall got involved and suggested that having sawed almost to the middle, why don't we split the rest with wedges, which is what we managed to do. And then, hey presto, the beam fell apart and we were able to see very nicely the saw cut marks of the diagonal marks of the pit saw going from one end and the other, and the section in here, triangle section here, where it's split out, which is exactly the same signature that you see on a lot of the old timbers when you see them in old buildings. You look out for those marks because it's an indication of how the timber was converted. So we ended up quite successfully, after about 10 days work, managing to saw the full length of this timber. And there we are, some of the team at the end admiring our handiwork. Not only that, we had some shorter curved timbers that we managed to saw down again to create curved braces to go underneath those beams. As you can see, we managed to prop them up just about so we were able to use pit saws to saw down there. And then with a bit of splitting, we were able to encourage the fibres to sever. Found there was one more, and then Lottie was able with her bare hands to pull the timber in half. And there again, you can see the signature of the saw coming up down there and down there at the other angle, and the nice triangle section here where it's split apart. And then we were able to dress it using hand tools to improve the look of the face a bit and to shape up the sides. We are using an adze to shape the bottom there. Then we got the timbers back over to Orchard Barn. Here we are, we did a bit more trestle sawing here using Rick's high-level trestles, converting another curved timber here using pit saws. And we even resorted to using a frame saw, which I made up, based on a design I'd used on another timber framing sawing course I'd attended, which Henry Russell and the Carpenters Fellowship had organised. So this is a copy of his, which uses a bandsaw blade here, and we were able, I think, if I click on this, there we go, you have to see it in action. It does work surprisingly well. We were able to shake that up, and thanks to Mike Taylor's efforts on the ground here, we were able to use that fairly well. And here we go, here are those braces being framed. See, we've cut the joints on the end. And here they are going to the tie beam, which we've got set up on trestles now. And we're framing the tie beam to come onto the teasel tenons on the end of the posts. We've cut the dovetail joints here. And the same at the other end. You can see it's got a huge curve on it, so that we can create more headroom for the upstairs part of this building. So coming together, and you can see describing that joint so that it matches the shape of the jowl on that post. And that's how the shoulder of that brace finished up. And then here we are cutting the end of one of the spine beams for the floor frame using the two-man cross cut there. And this was quite interesting for people who are a bit nerdy like me and like to look at the end grain of timber. This is the timber that we're using for our spine beam. You can see it's quite, if you look at the growth rings, you can see they're very evenly grown. Spacing there are very even, so it shows it was grown in a managed woodland, and the light levels were pretty consistent all the way through. But if you have a look at this ring here, something happened, and the tree was that age, which caused it to put on this reaction growth here, reaction wood here. And I was puzzling as to what caused it. And this feature appears at both ends of the timber. You see at one end here, and this is the bit that was cut off the other end. So whatever it was, it affected the whole of the tree. It wasn't just a localized issue that the tree was damaged there, and so for some reason it caused it to put that growth on. And I cast my mind back to my tree surgery days when I attended a lecture given by Professor Alex Shigo, who developed a theory of compartmentalization of disease in trees. And I suspect this shows where the tree was putting on reaction wood to try and prevent disease, which the tree may have become damaged for some reason there, and it was stopping any decay that got into the tree spreading into the cells of the tree that were grown on after the damage happened. So I then counted the number of growth rings and worked out that this tree was actually planted in about 1905, counting back from here, which is the sapwood is here. And then I counted the rings again and realized that that year, I reckon, equates to 1987. And it made me wonder whether that's an indication, because if you remember, 1987 was the year of the Great Storm. And I did wonder whether the tree had suffered in the storm, and this was some sign that it had done this as a reaction to it to prevent decay that might have got into the tree then spreading into the rest of the tree. That's just my theory, and it'd be interesting to know if anybody else has come across that on newly felled trees, to see whether in the future dendrochronologists might be able to use that as a dating technique for trees that are growing now. Anyway, as you can see, we carried on cutting this spine beam, cutting the joints for it, and here we are cutting the floor joists to go into it over a series of courses, and here we are cutting chamfers on the floor joists, because they're going to be a very visible part of the frame, so we thought we'd put a bit of decoration on there, doing some stop chamfers. Here we are cutting out the mortises, everything being done by hand, of course, no power tools. And here's Roger planing up one of the floor joists, because we thought we'd hand plane them, just the most visible elements of them, so that the floor frame will look quite spectacular once it's done. So by the autumn of 2019, we had the spine beams, floor beams framed, floor joist framed, and the internal cross frames for bays 1 and 2 prepared. We were starting to think about the practicalities of raising just part of the frame. Could we do it without using a mobile crane? After all, this is a low-impact, off-grid site. Large-scale powered machinery doesn't fit in with the ethos of the project at all. Maybe with a well-trained crew of volunteers, some adequate perimeter scaffolding, the use of pulleys, winches, and a genie hoist or two, we might be able to work out a way to safely lift all the timbers into place. After all, as you can see, I had done similar builds before when I started my timber framing career, and I had lived to tell the tale. This was a little aisled barn which we put up in Great Sandford, down in Essex. As you see, the timbers are all being lifted up on this tripod made up of scaffold poles. Health and safety was less of an issue back in those days, though, and we didn't care quite so much what sort of positions we got ourselves into. How we would then go on to construct the rest of the wall frames on the ground when the ends of the wall plates and the bay posts were already up in the air using only hand tools was another question I hadn't got an answer to. Another consideration which no one had yet addressed was the question of what the frame was going to sit on. Of course, we were building a reconstruction of the frame which used to stand on the site, built in 1580. So there was a brick plinth already existing. You can see some of it here. So let's try and go back to that. Here we go. There's a brick plinth already existing and had been adequate for 400 years. Okay, the building had collapsed, but this was not due to the plinth. We now began to realise, rather late in the day, that our frame was sitting in that grey area between conservation and new build. Its purpose had changed. There was to be public access and education, as well as accommodation on the first floor. Our building was now going to have to comply with modern building regs, not just for foundations and plinth, but also to meet modern thermal insulation requirements, access for the public, and fire regulations, etc. This was where the project had reached by the end of 2019. Then we all know what happened next. COVID struck, and all thoughts of putting a large team of volunteers together went off the agenda. Orchard Barn returned to the quiet, isolated spot it had been for years. But it did give us the opportunity to do some more planning. We now had several keen professionals on board, some with an architectural background and some with more construction and carpentry skills linked to the ability to use a computer to design CAD models for us. This is enabling the project to become more joined up and less piecemeal. During the summer of 2020, Sarah was able to call upon the expertise of her furloughed bricklayer daughter to rebuild the first two bays of the brick plinth using a hotline mortar mix. So that's what you can see in here. This is the actual plinth that our frame is going to stand on. So you can see there's enough there to bring us up to the doorway where the main entrance doorway is going to come, which is the end of the second bay. The first two of the cross ties were repaired by Rick Lewis and returned to site. And here's a very brief excerpt of a video he did for us. It just shows a little bit of the frame actually in his yard, which I think I can get to play. I have abridged this and it just shows a little bit of the beginning of it.
So this is the Orchard Barn floor beam. Look at the state of the poor thing.
So that's where the spine beams came in, so that's why it rotted out so badly there. It's also rotted back out at the end here as well. And the whole of the top section is very hollow, where it's been getting wet for centuries. So we got Stuart Armitage involved, and he drew up a plan for us about how we could go about repairing it. And here are some of the shots of the beam once it had been repaired, once it got back to the yard. So there's a lot of new dried timber gone in there, and not a huge amount of the originals left. But there's still enough of it to be worth retaining. Here we are, more of that same beam in position now that it's framed into the first of the bay posts here, and that's the other end. You see this joint coming together. And this is my attempt to show how the spine beam, which is this new timber here, which we've worked on, will be jointed into the middle of that repaired beam, and this is the joint that Stuart Armitage has specified. As you can see, there's a diminished shoulder on here, a big tenon in here, and then a little extra piece on here, a tusk tenon, which is this little piece here, before you get the bottom shoulder of the timber, which comes up against this new timber that's been added on here, and comes down to about the line down here on this old part of the timber. So the two should come together, but so far this is the closest together we've actually had from this photograph. We've managed to cut this joint here, and out in the car park area we've cut this here, but so far we haven't had the space to actually try the joints together, so that will be one of our next tasks, to bring them together and make sure they do actually fit. And of course, bear in mind there's an equivalent joint to this to cut on the other side of this timber, going the other way. So this big beam here has a lot of work to do, a big load to carry. Not only has it got this timber, but it's got all the floor joists that come into it. So there's a lot of work for it to do. So to go back to Marcus's CAD model that he made for us, from late February this year, we've been gradually gearing up and getting volunteers back on site to push on with the frame and frame the rest of the side walls and the north end. Because since we couldn't contemplate putting up the first two bays, we decided we would spend the time constructing the next two bays here, and the end wall here, and the two bays for the back wall. And I think the next few slides will show us where we've got to with that. This was back in February when we started to get volunteers back on site again, and you can see we've got, this is one of our next jowl posts, and we've created this by taking a big tree which we found back in Raiden Wood, we were able to purchase. We decided we would have a go at doing what supposedly the way they used to create their jowl posts, out of a single tree, quartered into 4 sections and reversed upside down. So we have the buttress of the tree that was in the ground. This was the base of the tree. We're going to use that to form our jowl here. And this is 1/4 of the tree. If you have a look here, you can see volunteers and working on the other pieces. You've got another one there, another one there, and another one there. And those are all from the same tree. This was the one we were looking at. And this is Ben here, an itinerant timber frame carpenter who turned up and offered his services for a month on site during April. So he and the volunteers set to and were able to frame, not only prepare these jowl posts, but frame the whole of the end wall. Here you can see we're notching the timbers down to our line here, ready to take them off with an axe. And here was one we did earlier. You can see the jowl formed here from the flared base of the tree. So that means that the fibres in this tree, the grain, runs all the way along here and follows on around there. So this is nice and strong. And we've got our tenon for the wall plate here. And this is where the teasel tenon for the tie beam will be cut in due course. Here we have more volunteers coming in. It looks like we were cutting mortises that day, all busy with the hand augers, drilling out holes prior to chiseling them out. There's Ben supervising them. A few more come in, all working on the frames, and they're up to more or less full strength, all busy at it. So here we have the end wall frame, the north end, pulling together, getting the studs and the mid-rail together, and the tie beam at that end. The tie beam at that end is a nice square flat one. We're not using a curved one there. There we can see it come together. Since I took this photograph over the last couple of weeks, we've now framed in some braces coming down here, wall braces coming down that side and this side. So this section is now all complete. And so our next few courses will be looking at starting on the roof frame. And this is going back to Lee Alston's original plan drawing he did for us when he did his survey. And you can see this is his cross section of one of the central trusses. And we're going to follow his ideas of having principal rafter roof trusses resting on the tie beams, diminished above the at the purlin position here to match the common rafters with clasp purlin collars here. So that's the design we're going to use, and we're now in the process of locating trees. And here we have a nice parcel of oaks, freshly felled from Bonnie Wood, which is, some of you may know it, on the edge of Barking. And I took this photograph yesterday, actually. We've got our name on 10 of these trees. You can see I've marked up where they've got to be cut, and we're hoping they will produce enough timber here to give us what we need for most of the roof frame. We're waiting for the timbers to be spread out a bit so that we can get to them. And we've got a team from Suffolk County Council coming in, hopefully on Thursday and Friday this week, to use their Lucas mill to convert all these for us to give us the timbers we need for the principal rafters and the purlin, and more of the common rafters. So that's where we've got to so far with the frame. I think I can just go back to Marcus's model here. This shows we've color coded it. Green is all the frame that has been completed and is ready to be erected. Yellow are the timbers, the sections that are being worked on. Oh, sorry, my finger's a bit not very sensitive. So we've got the two bays of the back wall still to do. We've got a little bit of work to do on. This is the timber that Rick has currently got in his yard, and whether or not he's started work on that, I'm not sure. We'll perhaps find out. We've got the back two bays of the back wall. We have the timbers for those already, and those are going to be worked on in the next few months. At the same time, today we started on the roof frame, and I was happy to be able to start getting some of the common rafters marked out, ready to cut. So we could in fact turn some of this section here yellow, as showing timbers that are being worked on. So you can see a fair proportion of the project has been completed, and we're heading in the right direction towards getting the rest of the frame ready. Now I'll skip back through to where we've got to. And I'll just, in conclusion, I thought I'd just introduce this into the mix as something to give you a bit of thought. Although Ringshall today seems a very quiet backwater, the time of our house was actually built back in the 1570s, 1580s. Ringshall was actually quite an important part of the country, and some quite influential and wealthy people were landowners in the area. This building is the original Royal Exchange building that was built in London financed by Thomas Gresham, who was a very influential merchant in the City of London, and he inherited from his father some substantial land holdings in the parish of Battisford, the next door one to Ringshall, and in Ringshall itself. And there's documentary evidence that he provided all the timbers and for the construction of this frame. This is all timber framed, built back. It was completed in 1571. And there's documentary evidence that all the timbers for this came from his woodlands that he owned in Battisford and the surrounding areas, which is less than a mile from where Orchard Barn House was built. And unfortunately, this building was lost in the Great Fire of London, but you can see it was extremely elaborate, very ornate and decorated, and shows a high degree of timber framing skills. And there's also documentary evidence that the frames for this were actually all cut and were framed in a yard in Battisford, just off the, if anyone knows it, it's just along Battisford Straight Road. So it's less than half a mile from the Orchard Barn site. So it would be nice to think, or there's supposition that maybe if the person who had the Orchard Barn house built was someone with a bit of wealth behind him and wanted to show it off, maybe some of the timbers that were used or weren't used in this frame maybe found their way into the Orchard Barn frame, because there must have been a big lot of converted timber lying about in the area, and I'm sure some of it perhaps didn't meet the grade for this project, but may have become used for other projects in the Battisford Ringshall area. And while I was doing research for this talk, I also came across this next illustration, which intrigued me somewhat, and also links to the talk which some of you may remember from a couple of years ago. Lisa Wall gave a talk on frames that have been lost to Suffolk, historical frames that no longer are in Suffolk. And I followed it up with a frame that was moved from Suffolk and ended its life over in California, in the Napa Valley. I hasten to say I have absolutely nothing to do with this frame at all, but this is a picture from the East Anglian Daily Times that was in March, and is actually the roof of a lovely old barn that comes from St John's Manor, which is again about a mile from the Orchard Barn site, and is actually the site of the house where Thomas Gresham lived, and he had the holding of that area. And this barn is a big barn that was on that site. Possibly this actual frame itself dates from a little bit later, but some of the timbers from that barn were used in a building that was on the site in Thomas Gresham's time. Apparently this frame was taken down in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and has been in storage ever since. It's very complete and would look very well on our frames that we have made, and would make a lovely roof for the Orchard Barn house. Unfortunately, it's coming up. The reason it was in the paper is that it's coming up for auction. And in fact, the auction day is on Wednesday, the day after tomorrow. So if anybody fancies making a contribution to the Orchard Barn project, they might like to consider putting in a bid for this, because it would sit very nicely on our frame. The only slight drawback is the guide price for this is between 70 and £100,000. So it is quite a nice complete frame, but that is for the unrepaired frame. So I suspect there's probably quite a bit of work to do after this has been purchased. Unfortunately, it's highly likely this is then going to leave the area and be erected somewhere else. So this is an example of yet another of our Suffolk frames, which is likely to no longer be available for us to visit. And with that, I think perhaps as my time is up, I'll end the talk there. And before I hand you back to Jane, I would just like to finish with perhaps something that one of our regular volunteers, Mike Taylor, who has been coming up very regularly, pretty much every week, from North London, where he lives, to spend a day in the Suffolk countryside. What he always says whenever he comes in is, what you have to remember with a project like this, it's all about the journey. So with that, I'll hand you back to Jane, and you can then all hasten down to the pub to celebrate the end of our long dry time and raise a glass undercover, hopefully. Okay, Jane, over to you.
William, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. It's quite rare, I think, to be able to see a frame being put together like that, and it's just wonderful. I'm sure there are going to be quite a few questions, so could you either unmute yourself or use the chat button, please? I'm sure if SHBG actually had enough money, we'd be glad to buy you that roof, but sadly we don't have that much.
Yeah, it would be nice, but no, I think that's going to be going somewhere else.
William, I can contribute something that you said about the Gresham buildings.
Oh yeah.
Gwinnett McKechnie asked me to do a survey of a building that was in your patch, and it's I've forgotten the name of it now, but Gresham's house is pretty well next door, I'm pretty sure, because there's a huge carved doorway in that house, which is the kind of thing a man of his stature would have. But the building in question was barn-like, but it had the equivalent of 2 hall windows in the front of it. It seemed to have, in its first form, it had no floor in it at all, except it had a gallery at one end with a lot of windows around that end. And I speculated that possibly it was used for actually framing up parts of the exchange internally in that building. And we did an SIA visit there, which is written up in the journal. Yeah.
Where? How close to?
Well, it's St John's Manor, I think, basically.
There's Ringshall. Timothy.
Ian, do you remember the name of the house?
It's Ringshall.
Ringshall, that's right.
Well,
Yeah.
St John's Manor is just up from the church at Battersford, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry, Anderson, you're talking about Ringshall Manor?
Yeah.
What's you?
It was Ringshall Hall that you went to, Timothy.
That's
St
right,
John's Manor is different. It's nearby, but it's a different.
Well, who lived in Ringshall Manor then? Because it was a very grand doorway.
I forget. I'll have to look it up. Gresham himself, obviously, is too important to have actually lived locally.
Yeah.
He was basically in London or actually in Holland.
Antwerp or somewhere as well. But is it possible that the reason there isn't any sign of any internal walls in our frame is that it had been used somewhere as a framing yard, perhaps?
Well, it'd be interesting to actually have a look at the one that was in Ringshall.
Yes.
I think I've got the drawings of it, and you see were there any similarities to what you're describing. It was then converted into a barn, and then it was very quickly afterwards, and then it was converted into a house. So it had gone through 3 phases in fairly quick succession. But the original phase, it was a big open building with a gallery at one end to look down on whatever was going on in there.
Right. So maybe the fact that this, the chimney stack may have been, if this was used as a framing building, then soon after, once the project was finished, they would then turn it into a house and put the chimney stack in.
Well, I don't know whether there's any such, do we know anything about framing houses? Is it just an unusual thing because of this project that was going on in London? That they needed to have a building to do internal work like that.
Yes, there's obviously a lot of very elaborate carving and things done on it, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Oh well, it's.
Any other questions?
I expect they've all gone off to the pub now.
William, when do you think you might actually, when might we be able to come and visit this house?
Well, you're welcome to come and visit whenever you like, when we're allowed to have visits. There will possibly be more to see sort of early September. We're hoping at least by then we'll have got the rest of the sidewalls done and hopefully a substantial amount of the roof framed. There are rumours of a raising date, but I don't think I want to tie myself down to anything like that. but certainly a September visit would be, early September would be a.
Okay, well, maybe we'll arrange something either for later this year or perhaps early in the spring.
Otherwise, early in the spring, certainly, yes. Yeah.
Could I ask about the shingle roofs? What's the evidence for that?
There's no historical evidence for that. It was just, I think, it was a method of, it was partly down to being able to come up with a method for running training courses that volunteered to create something that volunteers were able to get involved with and to cut the shingles. Mm-hmm. So it worked quite well from that point of view, particularly for the barn. But there's no historical evidence that there were ever shingles on either of those roofs. I don't think. It's much, I'm sure it would have been thatched, both of those.
I can't really understand it.
But I mean, shingles are a material that were used for throughout the that time, I think.
Yeah, we've only got one house in Lavenham left that's got its wooden shingles on.
Oh, right. When do they date from, do you know? Because I don't think they last more, well, even oak shingles wouldn't last more than sort of 90 years or so, I wouldn't think.
I don't know when they were last done. Certainly not since I've been here, 25 years, but they've got a lot of moss on them, which I think probably should be cleared off. But
I know. They are very susceptible, apart from anything else, they're susceptible to woodpeckers.
Oh.
I have heard of shingle roofs being very badly damaged by woodpeckers. But in fact, there's one, I think near, not far away anyway, I remember having to do some repairs on one.
Yes, Martin, please go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Trust me to be a bit obscure, but I've not be surprised to hear that I was interested by your cross section of the end grain there.
Yes.
And the problem was there included sapwood behind that barrier. It looks as if it
yes. Right on the very edge of the timber, there was a bit of sapwood, but there was about at least 25 years of heartwood growth before you got that.
But was there any included sapwood behind that barrier? So back in, because sometimes it gets preserved before the edge of the tree.
I don't think so, no. But there were signs that the cells inside the barrier they looked slightly different from the ones outside, as though there was a bit of decay getting in there.
Right.
And as though that barrier was doing its job in preventing the decay spreading into the wood that was put on afterwards. But I just wondered whether there was any signs of any evidence from other trees now growing that they had been affected by anything like the storm of 1987 or not. You know, it might not have had enough of an impact to actually make any difference to the trees.
Yeah, I don't know of any. I've not looked at many modern trees lately.
I know. The other thing that I wondered may have influenced over a wide area, and I don't think it was anything to do with that, was the fallout from the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and whether that had affected the growth of any of the trees. But I don't think that affected our part of the country, and if it did affect anything, it would have been in Wales and Scotland perhaps. But I just wondered in the future whether people would be able to see it making any difference to the growth of the trees.
It'll show up in the chemical content, but
yes,
not immediately visible.
No. Anyways, it was just interesting. I always look at the end grain whenever I cut into a piece of timber to see what I can see in it, but that's just me, I expect.
Right, Rick, have you got anything to add?
He's probably keeping his head well down.
Yeah, you could say that, William. Definitely keeping my head well down. No, no, I'm thrilled to see how far you've got. It's really good. You've made good progress. It's excellent. As far as the beam that is sat in the workshop, yeah, we're currently ignoring it.
Yeah, that's fine. We don't need it yet. We don't.
If I was to go to the workshop and work on it, it means I wouldn't be putting the frame up that we're putting up this week that forms the talk that I've just agreed to do in a few weeks' time. I would just also say about the barn that's up for auction as well. We've had a little tiny bit of input into that. That was taken down by Ron Ames and Mark and Tom, his two sons. We've had a bit of an ongoing discussion about that. And if and when it sells, we might have some hand in putting that up as well. Apparently, allegedly, we'll see. But yes, yeah, the beam should be with you in, I don't know, a month or maybe a little more.
Yeah, we'll be fine. We'll be ready for it.
Okay, right. Has anyone got any more questions? If you can unmute yourself. No. Okay. Well, in that case, William, thank you again. That was really interesting, and I look forward anyway to seeing the finished result.
Yeah, we'll